It is something that I do advise you to take some notes and pay attention. It's something that is not your typical spirituality. It's a topic that deals with some modern issues in a contemporary context. It deals with modern trends. It's a bit of a sensitive topic. And the way that I'll begin is by highlighting, in my opinion, 6 eras of Islamic history when it comes to intellectual thought. 6, if you like, epochs, 6 time frames, each one of which was indicated by certain trends. Now, every time you divide history into trends, there's always problems because there's exceptions to the rule. But it's safe to say that certain things happen. We have a electricity era, the steam engine era, we have the Google era, the internet era. You can say there are certain trends that are common in every single era. And if you look at our 14 centuries of Islamic history, this is one categorization scheme, and others can give their categorization schemes. The first of these 6 epochs was the prophetic era. And of course, this is the golden era. This was an era where the Prophet Muḥammad was alive, and as long as Rasulullah is alive, you cannot have any difference of opinion. You cannot have any 2 opinions about the same issue. You will take it back to him. He will tell you exactly what needs to be done. In other words, there is an ultimate point of reference, and that is the Prophet Muḥammad ﷺ, and therefore all matters, theological, political, social, every interpretation of the Quran, everything that the Prophet ﷺ says becomes the word of law. So there were no groups in his time of a nature that now exists. There couldn't be. You either believed in him, or you pretended to believe in him like the hypocrites, or you didn't believe in him. And that was really the only groups that were there. You either believed, or you pretended to believe that Allah knows you were pretending and the people assumed you were a Muslim, or you did not believe. Then the second era came, and I have called this the era of organic flourishing. The second era is really when all of the seeds are laid for differences of opinion in Islam. The era of organic flourishing. What is organic flourishing? Differences occurred, and these differences were not demarcated in lines. This is so-and-so, that is so-and-so. Rather, there was a fluidity. Rather, there was a continuum. It's organic, it's flourishing. And we find differences of opinion in every area. The earliest difference of opinion that ever occurred in Islam was of a political nature. Who's going to take charge after the death of the Prophet? The Ansar and the Muhajirun had a bit of attention. Who's going to make decisions? What if we disagree with political decisions? The Sahaba disagreed amongst themselves with political decisions. The Sahaba even went to war with one another over political decisions. They fought each other over political decisions. And those decisions were tolerated as being within the spectrum of Islam. Neither group considered the other to be un-Islamic. They said this is a wrong opinion, politically. But they didn't say this is basically not a correct or not a good Muslim. Also, early differences occurred over the role of the caliphate. Who should be the caliph and what is the role of the caliphate? And this was the earliest schism that really to this day is the biggest schism among Sunnism and Shi'ism. For Shi'ism, the caliph is a religious figure appointed by Allah directly. He's not just a caliph, he is in fact an imam with a capital I. He has a role, he has a God-given mandate, and whatever he says, it is as if Allah is speaking to mankind. Basically very similar to the Catholic notion of the Pope, that the Pope is infallible in all that he says. Similarly, we had this notion in early Islam that the Ahlul Bayt are basically chosen by Allah to be the leaders, and they have certain privileges. And of course, mainstream, or I should say Sunni Islam, disagreed, and they said politics is something Allah has basically relegated to choose whom and to run the affairs. This is something that is not sanctioned directly by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And these differences, again, they existed, and this is the second era. Theological differences also began in the second era, the era of organic flourishing. Theological differences were already mentioned Sunnism and Shi'ism. Perhaps the earliest theological difference was, what does it mean to be a Muslim? If you disobey Allah, are you not a Muslim? So the Kharijites said, if you drink, you're not a Muslim. If you lie, if you cheat, if you steal, you're not a Muslim. Whereas mainstream Sunnis said, no, these are sins and Allah is forgiving. You're not disqualified from Islam. You're simply a Muslim who has committed a sin. And the only thing that keeps you out of Islam is basically major shirk or major kufr. So this was a theological debate. Also, we had the issue of qadr. Very early on, in the time of the Sahaba, the first hadith in Sahih Muslim, look it up, the very first hadith in Sahih Muslim, Ibn Umar, as an old man, is doing tawaf, and somebody comes up to him from Iraq, and he said, oh Ibn Umar, we have a group that denies qadr, and says that things are spontaneous. وَأَنَّ الْأَمْرَ أُنُفٌ. Things are spontaneous, that Allah doesn't know it's going to happen. So they deny qadr, they deny predestination. This is Ibn Umar, is an old man, 70, 80 years old. So he's still alive, and he sees the first division in qadr. So he says, go tell them that the Prophet ﷺ has nothing to do with them. I.e., you are not real Muslims, you're deviant Muslims, because you've denied qadr. This group eventually became the Mu'tazila, much later on in the third era. We also had differences in understanding the nature of God, the nature of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And by the way, these differences began when Muslims first interacted with Christians. Christianity at this time was undergoing its own development. And there was a huge controversy in early Christianity over the nature of Jesus Christ and the relationship of Jesus Christ with God and the relationship of the Word. You know, the first sentence in the Bible, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. This is the first sentence of the New Testament. And Christians of this era were contemplating, were debating, what is this Word? What is this speech? How is Jesus linked with this speech? And this was translated into Islamic peoples by talking about the nature of kalam. What is kalamullah? Is kalamullah created or uncreated? This was a classical controversy. This eventually led to the biggest controversy that eclipsed all others for 700 years, and it still exists in Islam, and that is the nature of the attributes of God. This is, to be very blunt and frank, an imported controversy. Christians were having it, we were not having it. The Qadr controversy was coming from within us. The Iman controversy was coming from within us. As for the controversy over Allah's names and attributes, this was an imported Christian controversy that then became central to Islamic theology. Islamic theology developed its own notions. Some groups denied, other groups interpreted, other groups affirmed in a very literal manner. An entire spectrum came about. Again, this is the era of organic flourishing. We also have in this era Islamic law, organic flourishing. All of the major imams are living in this time. And more than the four, there were in fact hundreds of imams, thousands of great scholars, each one of which had their own legal opinions. And it was understood that these legal opinions were not going to make somebody a bad Muslim. It's okay to have differences in Islamic law. In this era of organic flourishing, we also have the beginnings or the seeds of variant practices of Islam, especially when it comes to zuhd, asceticism, how much you would be detached from this world. And this eventually became tasawwuf. The earliest zuhad, the earliest proto-Sufis basically existed in this time, and they lived a very different lifestyle, a very ascetic lifestyle. They started developing a theology as well. But again, this is the era of organic flourishing. So you could be a Sufi with tendencies to deny Qadr. You could be somebody on this madhab and be pro-Shia. So there's an organic flourishing. It's not demarcated into clear-cut groups. There's a fluidity, there's a continuum. This leads, and when is this? This is basically the first, the second, and really the third Islamic century, the era of organic flourishing. In the next era, and I call this the era of crystallization, begins from the late third, early fourth, and lasts for around 2 centuries. This is the era where really everything crystallizes, it becomes demarcated. This is Sunni, this is Sufi, this is Shi'i, this is Hanafi, Hanbali, Maliki. All of the law is codified into 4 madhabs. You have different trends. You have the Ash'ari creed, you have the Athari creed, you have the Mu'tazili creed. All of these creeds, you have different creeds and different sects being formed in the era of crystallization. Before this, the genesis of these sects existed. The thought existed, but it was much more fluid. You could have a mixture of a person. And in the era of crystallization was when really everything became clear-cut. And the major founders really of these movements lived and died, and they wrote their works. This is the era of crystallization. The next era is the era of development. And we can say this is from the late 5th to really the end of the 7th to the 8th Islamic century, the era of development. And in this era of development, all of these movements basically developed their theology, their books of law. If you look at the classical Islamic books of Sunni law, they go back to this era. If you look at the classical books of theology, the Ash'ari, the Maturidiyya, the Athari creed, they're all writing their books 400, 500, 600. This is the era really of basically crystallization. They're solidifying themselves. And the Hanbali tradition, or also called the Athari tradition, also called the Ahl al-Hadith tradition, this tradition clearly has its luminaries throughout this era, culminating really with the final great luminary, and that is Ibn Taymiyyah. That's the end of the development phase. We have in the Ash'ari creed as well. You have Al-Ash'ari himself, you have Al-Juwayni, you have Al-Ghazali, you have other scholars after, and finally Al-Amidi. Then you get the culmination, that is Fakhruddin al-Razi. And al-Razi really signifies the end really of the development and the change of Ash'ari thought. In this era as well, you have the Sufi tariqas solidified. These are the 700s, the 600s, the major Sufi tariqas, they solidify. And you have Junaidi Sufism, and you have other types of Sufism. You have the intoxicated Sufism and the sober Sufism. All of this basically comes in this era. This is the next era comes, and that is the era of ossification. And I call this the era of ossification, and this is from the 8th to the 12th Islamic centuries, and this is also called the pre-modern era. And the fact of the matter is, being very generic, but there's not much developments taking place. It's stagnant, it's ossified. Whatever existed pre-Ibn Taymiyyah is exactly what the tradition continued. Whatever Al-Razi finished up with, the Ash'aris continue down. Whatever theology was developed, basically continues down with very little originality. It's simply passing the heritage down. Then we come to the final era, and again, I'm being very simplistic here, much can be said, much has been written about each of these eras. We come to the final era, and that is modernity, from the Western sense of the word, crashing into and superimposing itself onto Islam. Modernity is a Western construct. Modernity is something to do with European civilization. And modernity developed independent basically of Islam. When modernity crashed with Islam, when modernity superimposed itself on Islam, this really begins the modern era of our thought. This is the final epoch, or the 6th era, and that is modernity in Islam. And one can embody or signify this with perhaps one of the most spectacular incidents of our modernity, and that is Napoleon Bonaparte and his invasion of Egypt. Napoleon Bonaparte was in 1792, somebody can correct, 1792 I think, he invades Egypt. And when he invades Egypt, he is coming with the Western army, with cannons, with artillery, with horsemen. He's coming with guns. And quite literally, the people he's fighting are the Mamluks. Quite literally, with scimitars and swords. Yes, there were a few guns here and there, but the Mamluks did not really have a gun regiment. They didn't have cannons that were basically organized the way Napoleon's army was organized. And wallahi, I think this is a snapshot of the reality of the Ummah. On the one hand, you have Napoleon. On the other hand, you have the Mamluks. And the Mamluks go back 700 years, and they're still around straggling. This was the end of the Mamluks. Napoleon eliminated the Mamluks. But can you imagine, on the one side, you have the French regiment, the French artillery, the French military, and they're invading a Muslim land. This is the beginning of colonialism, and they have all the weaponry of 18th century France. And on the other hand, you have people on horses with scimitars trying to defend their land. And obviously that did not work eventually. And of course, that's a different tangent. But really, this embodies modernity. And I have given an entire lecture that I encourage you to listen to, the rise and fall of the Ummah through the history of the printing press. That the printing press was basically shut off from the Ummah. The Ummah did not want the printing press because they considered it to be an invention of the Kafir. We're not going to take from the Kafir. Anything that the Kafir does, we will reject it. So for 350 years, when Isaac Newton, when Galileo, when others of this nature are printing and publishing their books, and ideas are being disseminated across Europe, Muslims still are handwriting. Up until there are printing presses in Hawaii, in so many faraway lands, before the first printing press began in Egypt. And this is, again, the closed mindset of the Muslim world. Now, the point being, in this modern era, when quote-unquote modernity was thrust onto the Muslim world, this sparked, this was a catalyst. You had to do something. You couldn't just sit there and let status quo remain. There had to be original thought. And so what happened 1850 onwards took a while, 70, 80 years, 1792, took a while. Eventually, the Muslim Ummah really had to react intellectually. And this really sparks the beginning of most movements that we in 2014 are currently familiar with, right? We have, for example, the Najdi movement of Saudi Arabia. Muḥammad ibn Abdul Wahhab began the Najdi revival. And this was really the one movement that had the least to do with foreigners. Because Saudi Arabia, Allah Azza wa Jalla protected Mecca and Medina from really being invaded directly by the Western lands. By and large, it was isolated, and this is the wisdom from Allah. So the Najdi revival, the modern Wahhabi or Salafi da'wah, if you like, and I don't like using the term Wahhabi, but it's an academic term. As an academic, I'm using it, otherwise the term is derogatory and I don't like it. So the Najdi da'wah is an example of basically one modern da'wah, but this is not connected with modernity. It was really an internal revival. But some examples of revivals that are affected by Europe and European civilization is, I think, the quintessential example for most of us in this country is the Deobandi school. The Deobandi school is a direct result of the failure of the Muslims in the political mutiny, in the uprising against the British. In 1857, the Muslims, along with some Hindus, they tried to rebel against the British in the mutiny. And there was a severe massacre, there was a backlash. And in fact, the Mughal emperor was in fact charged with treason, and he was then exiled to Nepal, and he died a miserable death in Nepal, and the Mughal Caliphate was abolished. Or they call it the Mughal Sultanate was abolished, and Her Majesty Queen Victoria basically took India for herself, and she became the Empress of India, and it became the Indian Raj. So this resulted in a defeatist type of mentality that resulted in a number of movements being formed. The most predominant example is that of the Deobandi movement, that they said the reason why this is happening is because we are not good enough Muslims. So what must we do? We must study the text, memorize the Quran, become good Muslims, and then from this, the Tabligis also, we need to send people into the villages, make them pray, make them practice. So this was a great movement for its time, but one needs to contextualize it. One needs to understand where it came from, what were the causes of the rise of Deobandism, and from Deobandism, a branch of it is the Tablighi Jamaat, and then countering the Deobandi movement, the Barelvi movement. Again, all of this one needs to contextualize, because for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. When the Deobandis came preaching a type of Islam that was not popular in some circles, so then the Barelvis also began with their preaching. And another trend began in Egypt, and that is really the triad of Ali and Abdul and Rida. I'm really zooming over things here because this is an advanced topic, but if you can take notes and look these people up. And this was basically the first time in the Arab world where people wanted to synthesize European modernity with Islamic thought. What is unique about Afghani and Abdul and Rida, Deobandis by and large were isolationists. They wanted to cut themselves off from the British. And the original Deobandi founders considered it impermissible by and large to have anything to do with the British. Don't learn their language, don't learn their sciences, dress in the upper, couture culture of 1870 Deoband, which is why they still dress in that manner, that they think this is the more Islamic. You're not going to wear the clothes of the British, you're not going to dress like the British, you're not going to speak the language of the British. So the by and large attitude was, these people are bad, they've ruined our country and land, why should we follow their ways? Of course, by the way, there was a counter-reaction to this, and that is Sayyid Ahmed Khan at Alayhi University. He went the exact opposite extreme. And he said the reason why the Muslims have failed is not because we didn't read the text and whatnot, it's because we didn't know technology. We didn't know the British language and the British culture and the British arts. So what should we do? We should study the arts of the British, the science of the British, the language of the British. So he founded Alayhi University. Point being, again, you have these things on the spectrum happening in India. In Egypt, you also had the same type of spectrum, but with a twist. Of course, I'm not even speaking of Iran. In Iran, there are movements taking place which eventually lead to Babism and Baha'ism, and eventually laid the foundations for Khomeini's political Shi'ism. By and large, Shi'ism was a very quietist movement for the last 400 years. In that, they didn't really get involved in politics, they just wanted to live their lives, because Shi'ism by its nature is awaiting the Mahdi. And because you're waiting for the holy figure to come, there's nothing you can do. And Khomeini, what he did was he revolutionized Shi'ism in his own way. And this is a factual statement. This is neither a praise nor a disparagement, simply a factual statement. So don't read into my statement. Khomeini changed the course of Shi'ism by politicizing it, by talking about before the Mahdi comes, we have the concept of wilayat al-faqih. We need to take charge before the Mahdi comes. Even if there's no Mahdi, we need to do something. And that's really what brought about the Islamic Republic of Iran. This is also a product of modernity. Khomeini and his thought is a product of modernity. So, what is all of this got to do with my topic? Well, now we get to the Afghani Abdul and Rida strand, and from it we get to the term Salafi. So, Afghani Abdul and Rida They're trying to synthesize, from their perspective, they're trying to synthesize modernity with Islam. Al-Ghani and Abdu are talking about and this notion that we still talk about, by the way, to this day. We are so proud to mention that Europe's advances are due to Islamic causes. We invented the astrolabe. We gave Europe the books of Aristotle and Plato. We were the ones who translated the Greek text. We carried the heritage of the ancients. We did. Where did this notion come from? Who was the first to verbalize it? This is really a little bit of Ghani and then Abdu. Abdu is really the one, and then Rida kind of reiterating this. And by the way, every one of us in this room, whenever we speak like this, realize, whether you know it or not, you are taking this thought from Ghani and then Abdu and then Rida. They're the ones who began. And frankly, I'll be very blunt here, there's an element of defeatism here. Like your success is due to us, right? There's an element of trying to impress the other. Like all of you are great because of us, right? I'm not saying that's wrong. Much of what they're saying is right. But look at the attitude when we say it, right? Fact of the matter is they took our sciences and went to the moon quite literally with it, right? And we didn't do that. So we have to also, be frank in this regard. But this notion of trying to synthesize modernity with Islam, trying to say that modernity is in fact Islamic, is what Abdu's main premise was, right? What Europe is on is what we should have been on. Ideal Islam is Europe. As he said in his famous statement that when he came back from France, he said that I visited a land, I saw Islam but no Muslims. This is France. And I came back to a land, Egypt, there were Muslims but no Islam. Right? And that's basically the thoughts of Abdu summarized in one sentence. And from Abdu, his student, Rashid Rida, and Rashid Rida was, again, an interesting figure, died in 1935, so very recent. 1935 is literally yesterday, right? There are people who were born, maybe even in this audience, before 1935, right? In 1935 is our century, less than 100 years ago. And so Abdu died 1935. And Abdu was really the first person to really invent this neologism, or this new term called Salafism. And Abdu's Salafism was basically a reaction to what he considered to be the ossification of an Azhar university. He criticized the attitude of the Azhar ulama for simply ignoring the political problems of the British, for ignoring these major issues and controversies and still teaching classical textbooks of Ash'ari creed and Shafi'i fiqh. He wanted a revival. He wanted to go back to the organic synthesis phase, which was the actual phase of the Salaf, right? Actually, the first 300 years of Islam didn't just witness one theology or one trend. It was an organic flourishing of many theologies and trends. So, Abdu said, let us respond to modernity by going back to the books and reinventing the wheel. By being Salafi, meaning thinking outside of the box. Jumping the ossification phase. Going back to when there were no madahib, there were no demarcated theological schools. Let's think things afresh. So Abdu's Salafism has nothing to do really with what modern Salafis call themselves Salafi. Think about this point. Abdu's Salafism, the term is the same. But what Abdu meant by Salafism is nothing that what modern Salafis meant. Yeah, there's a little bit of overlap, just a little bit. What is that little bit? That Abdu felt that Sufism was superstitious. So he was anti-Sufi. And he admired Ibn Taymiyyah for this element. Therefore, he had a sympathy for Ibn Taymiyyah. But in fiqh, he was very modernist, or we would call it liberal in our vernacular. In fiqh, he was very liberal. In theology, he wasn't a hardcore preaching the names and attributes and whatnot. Yeah, he sympathized with that, but it wasn't his main message. And so Abdu was really of the first people to begin this term, Salafism. Ironically, Abdu's movement really eventually became what we now call modernist Islam. Abdu's movement is still around. There are still people, it's very small, as a movement that directly takes inspiration from Abdu. But there are elements of our ummah, I call them, let's say, progressive Muslims, that yes, their initial genesis goes back to Ghani and Abdu and Rashid Rida. These progressive Muslims are more open to reinterpret the Quran in completely novel ways, completely unprecedented. They might not quote Abdu or Ghani or Rida, but really this is the genesis of this group in modernity. When you find groups that are justifying same-sex marriages through the Quran, This is novel in Islamic history. Never in Islamic history did anybody say the Quran preaches this type of toleration. Never. This is completely new. Really, the genesis of this goes back to Afghani and others of his nature, even though they didn't obviously do this, right? But we can say that we trace it back to that era. Now, Abd died in 1935. He was publishing perhaps the first international journal of Islam, and that is Majallat al-Manar, or the Lighthouse. This was the first journal of its kind, because remember, the printing press is a recent addition to the Ummah. Remember, the printing press goes back to the 1850s or so. So it's very recent. You cannot have an international journal. Whereas Europe has hundreds of journals in the 1700s. You have the Journal of the Asiatic Study here in England, right? And I myself, when I was at Yale, I looked up an article, 1802, an article printed in the Bulletin of Oriental African Studies about Wahhabism, it's called. I was looking it up about that. 1802, and they're talking about the Wahhabi movement of Najd, right? There's a journal being sent around the world. We Muslims didn't have any journal. We didn't have anything like that because we had shut off the printing press. Eventually, when it comes, it takes a while. Abdu really becomes the first with this journal. So this journal is being sent across the globe, all the way to Malaysia, to Timbuktu, to Middle East, to India. We have copies of these journals around the world for the first time. And he's spreading his idea. We need a tajdeed. That's what his key term was, tajdeed. Tajdeed means renovation. Tajdeed means rethinking. And he said this is a type of Salafiyyah, basically. And Salafism to him, as we said, is to basically go back to the organic phase of Islam. And in the late 1930s, a young scholar of Albanian heritage, whose father had run away from the communists and therefore had fled from the communists and sought refuge in the Ottoman Damascus, and this young budding self-taught scholar would study books and read and whatnot. His name is Muḥammad al-Albani, Allāh. He read this Majallat al-Manar, and he took this term Salafi and he fell in love with it. This term Salafi, he loved this term and he adopted it for his own movement, which was a movement that meant to purify fiqh from the ossification. He wanted to go back to the original fiqh, and that is non-madhab fiqh. And for the rest of his life, his main thrust was not theology, his main thrust was not Allah's names and attributes, his main thrust was not creed, his main thrust really was understanding fiqh through a hadith literature. And that's really one strand of Islam that has existed also from the very beginning. So he started calling himself Salafi, and he preached that it is obligatory to call yourself Salafi. And because he had an interest in hadith sciences, he was invited to the Islamic University of Medina at its very inception, was it 1963 or so, when it was first formed, and the Mufti of Saudi Arabia, the eventual Mufti of Saudi Arabia, Ibn Baz, invited him to teach hadith. He stayed there for 2 years. And the University of Medina, which is my alma mater, I studied there for 10 years, and I'm very, very proud, and I thank Allah that I studied there, and I have nothing but the best memories. And some people think that I have flipped and changed about this. Wallahi, it was the best time of my life to study there, and I thank Allah, and I am who I am because of Allah blessed me to study in Medina and then to go on and be who I am. So Shaykh Al-Albani was the first professor of hadith, along with Shaykh Abdul Ghaffar Hassan, who is the father of your own Shaykh Suhaim over here. His father, Shaykh Abdul Ghaffar, and Shaykh Al-Albani were the first two scholars of hadith in Medina. And that's where Albani, rahimahullah ta'ala, meets the Najdi da'wah for the first time. And he begins preaching the name Salafi to them. Otherwise, before this time, this da'wah, this trend, did not call itself Salafi. And from this, in the 60s, 70s, and then eventually 80s, the term Salafi was co-opted by the Najdi da'wah. And this da'wah is therefore a modern manifestation of a very classical Islamic school. The Salafi da'wah is a modern manifestation of a very classical Islamic school. And here is the point, that Salafism as a modern trend, Salafism has some precedence before it. But as it exists today, it is a very new and novel trend. In other words, every single manifestation of Islam is a manifestation that is contextual. It is a product of its own time. And every trend wishes to read itself into the back, into the previous. It basically back projects itself onto early Islam. And no movement, by and large, of Sunni and Shia Islam, no movement, by and large, likes to embrace modernity and change blatantly. They all wish to say, this is the original Islam. Do you think that Tablighi thinks that he is a separate movement from original Islam? Do you think that Deobandi feels that he is doing something other than what the Sahaba did? Do you think, no, this is the reality. Jamaat, I didn't even talk about Jamaat Islami and the Ikhwan. Do you not think that the Jamaat and the Ikhwan also view themselves as following what the companions did? From their perspective, and I'm not saying who's right or wrong, I'm just being academic here. From their perspective, this is what the Sahaba would have done. This is what the reality of Islam is. So every movement likes to back project itself on to the earliest time of Islam, and the fact of the matter is that every modern movement is a product of modernity, and there are elements that existed before this movement that it can trace its heritage to. And the Salafis are no different in this regard. The Salafi movement has certain similarities with previous movements. The Athari Creed, the Ahl al-Hadith Creed, the theology of Ibn Taymiyyah. This is something that is very clear. And yet, the Salafi movement is fractured when it comes to issues of modernity. They haven't yet overcome or unified what they should do with regards to fiqh. They don't know about methodology in terms of relationship with other movements and other groups. They're still talking about basically issues of political allegiance. How exactly can Muslims live in nation states? What is the role of the president or the king? Does he become a khalifa that we must obey and hear? Or this and that? All of these are basically issues of contentious difference. And also, of course, the issue of jihad as well. And the role of jihad is, as we know, predominantly the jihadist groups, ISIS and whatnot, and AQAP, all of these jihadist groups, predominantly they come from the Salafi spectrum and not from the Deobandi, not from the Tablighi spectrum. And this is because, again, Salafism by its nature really was a very independent thought. Salafism told its followers, be independent, break away. Whereas Deobandis, by the way, by and large, are structured. If the Grand Mufti or the great, or I should say, the Akabir, if you like, right? If the Akabir haven't said it, it doesn't translate down to the people below them. They have a hierarchy and a structure, and each has the pros and cons, by the way. There's no right and wrong here. There are pros and cons in every movement. There are positives and there are negatives. And when you have a hierarchy, well, then original thought is shut off. And frankly, this is one of the problems of all such movements that have hierarchies. If you have an original thought, a novel idea which is good, it's going to take a lot of difficulty for it to be adopted by the movement. Whereas if you have an open license, well then you have a lot of new thought, but you also have a lot of strange thoughts as well. And that's what's happening with the Salafi spectrum of things, that as it's interacting with modernity, many of them feel we need to basically go back to the classical texts of jihad and cut and paste them and do exactly what Ibn Qudama writes in 650. Let us go do this in Iraq right now. They'll quote a fatwa from so-and-so and think this applies right now. And really, fiqh is all about applying the text to any modern situation. Anybody can open up a text 300 Hijrah. Anybody can read from what Al-Badawi or somebody writes. Real fiqh means that what is the job of the faqih? The job of the faqih is to translate these realities into modernity. What does it mean, X, Y, and Z, when we do it in 2014 London? What is the reality of this? And that's the job of the faqih. Anybody can be a literalist. It's not that difficult. But the faqih is the one who translates the literature, the text basically, into the context. So Salafism, no doubt, as its modern, if you like, manifestation, has a lot of good. But the fact is, and I mentioned some of this good. I've written an article, I encourage you to read it. It's called On Salafi Islam. It's a very recent article, and I encourage you to read it. It has a lot of good. But at the same time, Salafism as well needs to recognize that they are a product of modernity. That the fact of the matter is, Salafism as it exists today is not the Salafism of even 200 years ago. Imam al-Shawkani, whom they consider to be a Salafi, did not have the same type of Salafism. Al-San'ani, even Ibn Taymiyyah, each one has a different manifestation of things that are same and things that are different. There is no such thing as a Platonic Universal, I say. There's no such thing as an abstract reality. There's only the reality that we live. And so Salafis, Deobandis, Ash'aris, they are not some abstract reality. They exist tangible in real life, and you see them as they are. And in my humble opinion, the Salafi movement has many positives, and we should embrace these positives. And of those positives is the purity of its creed, the primacy of the sacred text, the encouragement of critical thinking, the avoidance of superstitious, if you like, rituals and over-exaltation of saints, an emphasis on hadith authentication, an emphasis overall on knowledge. All of these are great aspects of Salafism. But Salafism also has some negatives as well. And that is, in my humble opinion, one of the greatest negatives is that it has taken issues of theology, abstract issues of theology, and made them the ultimate goal over and above actual religiosity. So it is more important for many Salafis to affirm Allah's attributes than it is to worship Allah through those attributes. It's more important to be tested about the creed, where is Allah and what does it mean when Allah has risen over the throne, than it is to actually have religiosity. And Salafis need to realize, and let me be very blunt here, that if Umar ibn al-Khattab radiallahu ta'ala anhu was amongst us right now, and they gave him a quiz of aqeedah, the fact of the matter is, that test that you put in front of him, he would fail it. Think about what I'm saying before you throw stones at me. You will ask Umar ibn al-Khattab, what are the categories of Tawheed? What do you think he's going to say? You will ask Umar ibn al-Khattab, what does it mean, Ar-Rahmanu ala al-Arsh, so explain in detail. You will ask Umar ibn al-Khattab about the realities and intricacies of abstract issues that they never thought about. You will ask Umar ibn al-Khattab even about basic issues of fiqh that we are memorizing in our textbooks, right? What are the nawaqid al-wudu? What are the nawaqid of this? What are this? What are the shurut al-wudu? What are the shurut of salah? The Sahaba did not think in these ways. So the question that I'm asking is, who is the more Salafi? The Salafi or Umar ibn al-Khattab? Think about it. If even somebody as great and as austere as him would not be thinking along those lines. Why? Because again, this is the era of organic synthesis. The thought is just beginning. The seed has been planted. Wallahi, Umar ibn al-Khattab is billion, I can't even put a number better than me and you. We know this. And yet, a Deobandi, a Salafi, an Ash'ari, anybody were to quiz him, a first-year exam from Darul Ulum, from Medina, from Azhar, from any institution, he would fail in every single subject. Think about it. What does that mean then about the realities of these movements? Our movements are a product of modernity. Our movements have been developed because of certain contexts. And the problem comes when we have this naive assumption that the movement as it exists today is exactly what they themselves would have done. No, that's the problem. So what this leads to is arrogance. And this is another major problem in my opinion of the Salafi da'wah. And that is this assumption that we are right in what we do, in everything that we do. And if anybody disagrees with us, they're absolutely wrong. And I disagree with this attitude. Every movement, do you really think that the Deobandis don't want to come closer to Allah and follow the Sunnah of the Messenger? Do you really think that any movement that loves Allah and loves the Messenger has anything in their mind other than to come closer to Allah through the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ? This is the reality. Now, I'm not saying that all of these movements are equally correct. I'm saying every movement has its positives and its negatives, and the fact of the matter is that Islam is more than just theology. Another issue that I have with the Salafi movement is that in its rejection of extreme tasawwuf, they rejected realities that are spiritual in nature. Call it moderate tasawwuf, call it tazkiyat an-nafs, terms are irrelevant. The fact of the matter is, we should have muraqabatullah. The fact of the matter is, we should have mujahadat an-nafs. The fact of the matter is, we should have all of these terms that the Sufis love to talk about. These are Islamic concepts. These are concepts that the Prophet spoke about. And Salafis, in their rejection of extreme Sufism, ended up basically neglecting spirituality. And these are stereotypes that every one of us who is an activist in Islam, we realize and we know. And that is that, by and large, Salafism is not about spirituality. And this is a mistake, because Islam is about spirituality. By and large, Salafism does not inculcate these issues of, basically having a relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Also other issues as well that I mentioned in the article. And therefore the fact of the matter is that once one has understood that every single modern movement is a product of modernity, and wallahi, someone like myself, I cannot simply become a card-carrying member of any movement. Every movement is changing. It is fluctuating with time. Every single movement. And the ideal of something called Salafism is really the ideal of Deobandism and every other movement. I.e., what is Salafism? We want to follow the Salaf. As I said, ask the Deobandi, ask the Tablighi, ask any person that is generally believing in Allah and loving the Messenger. Do you not want to follow Allah and His Messenger? Do you not want to follow the Salaf of the Ummah? Now that doesn't mean everybody's right, but I'm saying as an ideal, that is an ideal that by and large, the majority of Sunni Muslims embrace. And again, I do refer you to the article. I don't have time to go through all of the other issues. But the fact of the matter, and I want to basically conclude on this point, and then inshallah leave some time for question and answer, that yes, I have been through phases myself. 20 years ago, I too really was a card-carrying member of the Salafi movement. People ask me, are you still a Salafi or this and that? And the term to me now is really, it depends on what you mean. The term is, quite frankly, whatever you make it out to be. So if you mean, do I still follow the theology that Ibn Taymiyyah, if you like, taught and preached? I say this is the safest extraction, human extraction of theology, because in the end it is a human extraction. As I said, if you were to ask Umar ibn al-Khattab the three types of Tawheed, he wouldn't be able to answer you. Think about that. If you were to ask Umar ibn al-Khattab about any of these abstract issues, about the realities of Iman, this, and what are the arkan of Iman, these are not questions that even if the Quran created or not. This is the fundamental issue of Sunni Islam, from which the Mu'tazilites and others basically separated from us. We believe the Quran is uncreated, the speech of Allah. The Sahaba did not ask this question. The question did not occur to them. And I firmly believe, this is my belief, take it or leave it, that if you asked Umar ibn al-Khattab, is the Quran created or not, he would have taken a stick and beat you. How dare you ask these questions, right? I firmly believe that if a Muslim went around Medina saying, where is Allah, where is Allah, where is Allah, that Umar would have you whipped and flogged in public. This is my opinion, that you're causing controversy. And that's exactly what, unfortunately, many of those who ascribe to Salafism have become. So if you ask me, am I a Salafi? I say the term is ambiguous. The term is really whatever you make it out to be. I believe that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala revealed a book that is called the Quran, that is His speech. I believe that the Prophet Muḥammad is the final prophet. I believe that the best people on this earth were the companions. I believe that the Athari movement of the first 2-3 centuries was the most pristine movement, human movement that was extracted from the divine text, and I believe therefore that that is the movement that deserves the most respect. But I also say modern Salafism as it exists is but a human attempt to get to that ideal. And therefore it has pros and it has cons, and therefore I don't call myself either a Tablighi or a Deobandi or a Salafi or a Sufi. All of these terms have some truth in them, and I would encourage and want the modern Salafis in particular to think about some of these issues and realize that the word Islam is broader than any one term. And that if our Prophet ﷺ were alive today, what would his relationship be with the other movements and groups out there? Think about that as well. Let no one be so arrogant as to say that, yes, this is what the Prophet ﷺ would have been about. No, this is what you think. This is what you believe. But the other person that you're disagreeing with, he believes the exact same thing about his creed, about his beliefs. Does that mean both of them are right? No, it doesn't. But it means the sincerity can be on both sides. And guess what? Allah judges primarily with what? By what? Sincerity. Allah judges primarily with what is in your heart, and therefore, in my humble opinion, generic Sunnism, because by Sunnism, by what do I mean? I mean respect of the Sahaba. This is what I mean by Sunnism. Generic Sunnism is what is the saved sect and the creed that the Prophet ﷺ predicted would be the victorious creed. The hadith that mentioned this is what these hadith apply to. And as for the movements that are not generically Sunni, we say that there is issues with them, and we take them on a case-by-case basis. No doubt creed is important. No doubt it is important. But creed is not the end-all, be-all of Islam. Creed is one element of Islam. There's also ibadah, there's also worship, there's also mu'amalat, there's also suluk, there's also how you deal with others. And it's a package. And if Salafis have some good in one area, and if Sufis have some good in another area, and if the Tablighis have good in another area, the wise person takes the good from the other and weighs it with the bad. And this is not the manhaj of some, let's not use the terms that those guys use. This is the manhaj of Allah Azza wa Jal. And on the day of judgment, Allah Azza wa Jal will weigh your good and your bad. And we as well, we look at the good, and if a person has more good than bad, we make excuses for the bad. And if a person has more bad than good, that's a different story. But if a person overall, and the hadith that I always remind myself, and I remind you all of, and I will conclude with this inshallah ta'ala, our Prophet ﷺ said, "Man salla salatana, wastaqbala qiblatana, wa akala dhabihatana, fadhalikum al-muslim." The one who prays our salah, and he sacrifices according to our manners of sacrificing animals, and he faces our qibla, that is the one you judge him to be a Muslim. You judge him to be a Muslim. Upon him is the protection of Allah and His Messenger. So be careful and beware of rejecting the protection of Allah and His Messenger. If a person shows religiosity, if a person says the kalima, the basic ruling is this person is a Muslim. unless and until something comes other than that. And that is what our Lord has commanded us. That is what our Prophet ﷺ has commanded us. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala grant us the iman and the taqwa and the ikhlas to recognize Him alone to be worthy of worship and to follow the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. Wa akhiru da'wana alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.